Well, welcome to the second part of this lecture series. It's Dr. Budnaniakara once again. Before we start, just to quickly recap the first part, remember that we learnt that oxygen, by its role in aerobic respiration, produces large quantities of ATP, and ATP is the energy currency of the cell, and it's required for normal human functioning. What we will learn in this part is how oxygen from the ambient environment is brought in through the lungs into the circulatory system, pumped via the heart into the tissues, where oxygen can be utilized by aerobic respiration, specifically by the mitochondria, to produce sufficient quantities of ATP. So this is a diagram of the cardiorespiratory system. Oxygen is inspired by the lungs. It enters through the trachea, down into the alveoli via the process of convection and diffusion, and then from the alveoli it diffuses passively down its concentration gradient into the pulmonary capillaries and then on through to the left side of the heart, where the oxygenated blood is pumped to the tissues. Remember, in the tissues, metabolism occurs, whereby oxygen is utilized in aerobic respiration to generate sufficient quantities of ATP in order to support the normal cellular function. As a byproduct of aerobic respiration, you may recall that carbon dioxide is produced. And this carbon dioxide is a waste product, it's a gas, and it gets transported via the venous circulation through the right side of the heart back into the pulmonary circulation, where it's expired in exhaled gas as carbon dioxide. Oxygen is inspired, carbon dioxide is exhaled. Let's take a closer look at metabolism. So you may recall that glucose was a 6-membered carbon ring, and when used with oxygen produces 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water, and 36 molecules of ATP. Oxygen comes in and trained from the air in through the lungs, pumped via the heart whilst it's in arterial blood into the tissues, where it can undergo the process of glycolysis, then aerobic respiration, and eventually form ATP. The carbon dioxide that's produced is then transported back out, and it's expired as exhaled gas. Now, it's important to remember that with glucose, for every molecule of oxygen, a molecule of carbon dioxide is produced. For 6 molecules of oxygen, 6 molecules of carbon dioxide is produced. And remember how oxygen fits in. It accepts the terminal electrons. It then becomes reduced to water, and that process is enough to generate the energy required to synthesize ATP. So we must digress into a bit of atmospheric physics and focus on gas laws to understand the concepts in the next section. Now, a gas is simply a state of matter, such as a solid and a liquid. With a gas, the particles are free-flowing. They're free to move independently of one another. Now, when a gas is contained in a container such as this blue beaker here, these molecules may randomly bump into the sides of the molecules. When they bump into the sides of the molecules, they exert a force. Now, force per unit area is the definition of pressure. Let's just say we doubled the gas molecules, you can imagine that there will be 2 times as much force for the same area, and therefore pressure would be doubled. Let's add another gas. This is a completely different gas. Let's call it gas 2, the yellow ones. Now, gas 2 also bumps into the sides of the molecules, also exerts a pressure. The sum total of the pressure, or P total, is equal to each of the individual pressures combined. The partial pressure of the green gas, gas 1, as well as the partial pressure of the yellow gas, gas 2. To express it in a different way, the total pressure is the sum total of the individual partial pressures of the gases, and it can be calculated knowing the fraction that each individual gas has in relation to the total gas. For example, in this example, the yellow gas occupies 1/3 and the green gas occupies 2/3. So the fraction here is 1/3 of the total pressure, and the fraction here is 2/3. So the total pressure will be 1/3 of the third of gas pressure 1 and 2/3 of gas pressure 2. This will be a bit clearer when we explain a real life example. Let's consider the atmosphere. Now, the atmosphere has gases, gases are molecules, and molecules exerting pressure. At sea level, we can measure the barometric pressure at 760 millimeters of mercury. Now, 21% of the gas is oxygen. So we can say that the partial pressure of oxygen is 21% of 760 millimeters of mercury, which is 160 millimeters of mercury. Now, let's look at the lungs. So obviously, to get oxygen, we get it from the environment. So we know that the amount of, or the partial pressure of oxygen is simply the barometric pressure times the fraction of inspired oxygen. So at room air, remember, we have the atmosphere is 21% oxygen. So at 760 times 21%, or 0.21, which is 160 millimeters of mercury. So the partial pressure of oxygen that we breathe in ambient air is 160 millimeters of mercury. Let's take a sojourn up to Mount Everest, very tall mountain with an elevation of greater than 8,400 meters. Clearly, the barometric pressure here is going to be low, and that's because at 8,400 meters, gravity just does not exert the same force, so it's not able to keep the same amount of gas molecules, and therefore the barometric pressure is significantly less. It's 253 millimeters of mercury. Now, oxygen is still 21% of this, so the partial pressure of oxygen is 21%, or 0.21 of 253 millimeters of mercury, a measly 53 millimeters of mercury. Now, this is clearly difficult to sustain, and it's no wonder that a lot of people perish on the summit to Mount Everest, particularly if they do not have oxygen. Now, suppose we add on supplemental oxygen. So we're enriching the air that we breathe with oxygen. So let's just say we enrich it to 50%. We'll make the gas that we breathe 50% oxygen, just through having an oxygen concentrator. So now we have 0.5 times 253 brings us to 126 millimeters of mercury, which is much better than 53 millimeters of mercury. So what's the next step? Well, as oxygen gets breathed in, we bring it in to the nose. And in the nose and trachea, there is warmed. It's at 37 degrees Celsius, and it's humidified, so it brings in water vapor. The problem with this is that water vapor, which is water in gaseous form, displaces the oxygen molecules. And so we must correct it. And physiologists correct it by subtracting the barometric pressure by 47 millimeters of mercury, because that's the water vapor pressure at 37 degrees Celsius. And that means that the partial pressure of inspired oxygen is 150 millimeters of mercury. To express it a different way, you can see that the water vapor is now taking space. And so the remaining oxygen occupies a lot less pressure, and we need to account for that as such. So we've brought in oxygen at 160 millimeters of mercury, assuming it's room air. It's been humidified, and that accounts for that 10 millimeter drop to 150 millimeters of mercury. And we followed this equation here. But what happens when we get to the alveoli? Remember what's happening in the alveoli. Oxygen is diffusing into the pulmonary capillaries, and carbon dioxide is coming out into the alveoli. There is gas exchange. So how do we account for that? Well, to account for this dilution of gas, we need to correct for it. And there is an equation here, but let me try and explain to you the principle behind this equation. Firstly, we have to go back to metabolism. Remember, if we're eating a completely glucose-rich fuel, for every 6 molecules of oxygen consumed, we produce 6 molecules of carbon dioxide. So, if I measure the partial pressure of carbon dioxide here in arterial blood as 40 millimeters of mercury, that must mean that 40 millimeters of mercury of oxygen was consumed. So, in the alveoli, 40 millimeters of oxygen would have had to have come out. Let's just say that we eat a meal completely full of fat. Well, here, for every 23 moles of oxygen, 16 moles of carbon dioxide are produced. So we know that much more oxygen is consumed than carbon dioxide's release. So if we measure the carbon dioxide concentration as 40 millimeters of mercury, we know to get that number, a lot more oxygen must have come out. And so we have to account for this with what we call the respiratory quotient. And the respiratory quotient is simply the amount of carbon dioxide produced, VCO2, over the amount of oxygen consumed. So for glucose, that equals to 6 upon 6, which equals to 1. For fat, that equals to 16 upon 23, which equals to 0.71. And you can see the dilution of alveolar air by carbon dioxide. And this is the equation here. So to account for the oxygen in the alveoli, this is P alveolar oxygen, we take the amount of oxygen that has been entrained from the air, that has been diluted by water vapor, and we must subtract a portion due to gas exchange in accordance to this ratio, minus PaCO2 upon R. Now I hope that this ratio kind of makes sense. Let's try and have a look at it graphically. So, in the alveolus, we have a mixture of water vapor, we have a mixture of oxygen, and we have a mixture of nitrogen. Remember, With gas exchange, oxygen diffuses in, and carbon dioxide diffuses out. Now, if for every molecule of oxygen consumed, a molecule of carbon dioxide is produced, where R equals to 1, for example, just eating glucose, then the alveolar oxygen is simply 150, which is this term, minus PaCO2. We'll take normal PaCO2 as 40 millimeters of mercury, divided by R, which equals to 110 millimeters of mercury. If we have a normal diet, which is a mixture of fats and carbohydrates, then physiologists have measured this as the respiratory quotient, which is V.CO2, carbon dioxide produced, to amount of oxygen consumed at 0.8, then this becomes 100 millimeters of mercury. That's because more oxygen is leaving the alveoli for the carbon dioxide that enters. So the alveoli is losing a lot more oxygen. So we have to account for that. Now, what happens when the oxygen gets to the alveoli and diffuses into the pulmonary capillaries? Is there any loss there due to a diffusion barrier? Well, the simple and straightforward answer is no. And to explain that fact, we just need to have a look at an electron micrograph of a pulmonary capillary with a red blood cell in it, as shown here. Sorry, let me just change the color of my pen so that we can see. So we have a red blood cell here. It's outlined here. The pulmonary capillary, so this is the nucleus of the endothelium, and we can see the pulmonary capillary kind of outlined here, and then we can see the alveolus outlined as such, and it kind of goes out all the way here. So the oxygen from the alveoli, so if this is the alveolus, simply has to diffuse this gradient, which is essentially, less than 2 micrometers in thickness, which is hardly anything at all. What's also impressive, and we'll cover this, is that you can have a look at this red blood cell. It's essentially almost the same width as the pulmonary capillary itself. And it's getting squashed and deformed as it traverses through, and the red blood cell has very beautiful structural adaptations that allows this to occur. And we'll certainly cover this in another part of the lecture. So, as the oxygen enters, I'll just change the pen again, sorry. As the oxygen enters through the atmosphere at 166 millimeters of mercury, then it becomes inspired and humidified, and we drop to 150. I hope that makes sense. Then gas exchange occurs, it's diluted, becomes 100 millimeters of mercury. Remember that there is no downstep in oxygen as the oxygen goes into the pulmonary capillary. The diffusion barrier is so small, as witnessed by the previous electron micrograph. But what happens when it reaches the arterial circulation, say over here? Well, it so happens that there is what we call venous admixture or shunt. And this occurs when there is blood that goes from the right side of the circulation to the left, such as here or like this, and completely bypasses the lungs. Now, this can occur with the bronchial arteries. So bronchial arteries arise from the aorta, so they arise from the left side of the circulation. They go in and supply the bronchi and the trachea with nutrition, but they drain into the pulmonary veins, and they drain such that oxygen oxygen isn't exchanged. It bypasses oxygen. It's a shunt. Thespian veins is another form of shunt, and thespian veins arise with the heart draining to the myocardium directly into the left side of the heart, completely bypassing the lungs. A patent foramen ovale is a connection between the right atrium and the left atrium. Again, if blood's flowing through the right atrium to the left atrium, you're bypassing the lungs. And there's also other arteriovenous malformations within the lung itself. So there's where the pulmonary arterioles are connected to the pulmonary venules, completely bypassing the alveoli. And you can see almost an arteriovenous malformation here. Now, I won't explain this slide, but you should peruse this and see if you can understand the concepts. But suffice to say, if you imagine deoxygenated blood coming from here, bypassing oxygenation is going to cause a reduction in the oxygenation of the arterial blood. And that explains why there is a downstep from your pulmonary capillaries into your arterial blood. And then what happens is the arterial blood's obviously pumped by the strong pump of the heart. The oxygen is delivered to the tissues, where the oxygen is extracted by the cells and into the mitochondria, where it participates in aerobic respiration. And that leaves the venous blood oxygenation to be about 40 millimeters of mercury. And that explains that. So I hope that cascade makes sense. I hope it makes sense that oxygen comes from the environment, and we calculated the partial pressure of oxygen in room air at atmospheric pressure at sea level. I hope it makes sense that at Mount Everest, where the barometric pressure is remarkably low, that the amount of oxygen inspired would also consequently be remarkably low. I hope the fact that in the alveolus, oxygen is exchanged for carbon dioxide, I hope that makes sense, and I hope it also makes sense that explains why the oxygen in the alveolus falls from 150 millimeters of mercury to 100 millimeters of mercury as the oxygen is replaced by carbon dioxide. Now, I hope that the concept of venous admixture also makes sense, because normally about 5% of blood that comes from the right, so the deoxygenated blood, 5% of that bypasses the lungs completely, and that is normal. Obviously, pathologically, for example, if there's a massive septal defect within the atrium or within the ventricles, that can lead to a markedly bigger shunt, and that can lead to remarkably lower oxygen levels. So that concludes the second part of the lecture. I hope you guys enjoyed that.